Thank you so much. And thanks for those who are here. I am so sorry not to be there in person. I live in Berkeley. It is normally very easy for me to be in Berkeley, but I had to be in New York yesterday and today for funder meetings, which, if you've ever run a nonprofit, you know is very important. And also to meet with the New York Fed on critical insurance issues for California. So all important things, but I'm very sorry not to be there in person. Thanks for still being here, bearing with me. I have slides. I'm going to put up my slides. I'm going to probably do maybe like, I don't know, a half an hour, and I'm going to leave a bunch of time for questions. So really do think about questions. I love Q&A. It's my favorite part of these talks always. And I'm excited to get into it. So I'm really going to talk today about a kind of a high level kind of context setting around like where we need to go with transportation planning, land use planning, and really economic planning in this moment of transition that we're in California, but really, frankly, globally. So I'm going to talk a little less about individual technologies than some of your other speakers probably have, but more about the context in which we're making all of these decisions on the planning and the policy and the investment side. It is not advancing. Hold on one second. There we go. We are really at a kind of a pivotal inflection point. We've had about 20 years of really significant shocks to the economy. And those shocks range from shocks to our geopolitical system, to our economic system, and of course, shocks from climate change itself. That 2 decades, I argue, have led us to a place where we are more willing to do things differently, more willing to plan for a transition of the economy and to implement the hard things we have to implement to get to that transition. So what do those shocks look like? Well, we have a set of shocks around geopolitics. We have had a very complex relationship with China, which has gotten, frankly, more fraught over the last 2 decades, but particularly the last 5 years. We had, of course, COVID, and COVID underscored for us, what happens when you are extremely dependent on China for all your supply chains, and what happens when you have the shock of that kind of falling apart. We've had the Russia-Ukraine invasion, which feels a little less like a shock here in California, a huge shock to Europe, of course, in terms of its disruption to its gas supply, its natural gas supply. That, of course, has led to the US supplying our allies in Europe with far more gas, which has essentially changed our energy transition strategy for geopolitical reasons. Increasing attacks, increasing instability overseas, attacks on oil tankers like this one, and all of these disruptions, whether they are the COVID disruptions, the Russia disruptions, the attacks leading to higher gas prices in a market that is set globally and is extremely vulnerable to geopolitical shocks. At the same time, a significant economic shocks, obviously back in the Great Recession, the housing crisis, significant fallout on the housing side. And actually, that fallout from the financial crisis is still, the repercussions are still being felt. What that ended up doing was that we had a significant decrease in building of housing for about 10 years, and we're still not caught up on housing supply, as we know well here in California. COVID, of course, major shock to the economy. This incredible vacancy rates in downtown San Francisco and downtown California cities. And of course, just, increasing homelessness, increasing kind of COVID really underscoring the fissures in the economy, the inequality that we already had in the economy, but wasn't as obvious until COVID hit. And then, the increasing, those were kind of past shocks, but we have this steady march of increasing climate shocks. So as we've got those geopolitical impacts, those economic impacts to our system, we've also got these climate impacts. Obviously, these are all California examples of fire and flood and heat. But of course, just seeing this play out a couple of weeks ago in Florida and seeing what happens when you have, literally billions, hundreds of billions of dollars of impacts from climate on our existing systems, on our existing infrastructure. So all of these things are kind of the surround that's really led us toward the idea that we need to do things differently. We need to invest differently. We need to plan differently. We need to we need to build infrastructure differently. In California, the rising threat of climate change back in 2006. This is a picture of then Governor Schwarzenegger signing what is now the cap and trade bill, but AB 32, which was cap and trade, our renewable standard energy standards, and our low carbon fuel standard, signing all of those into effect. Really groundbreaking regulation and carbon pricing in California that's led to a whole host of policies and regulations that I'll talk about in a minute. The Green New Deal, under kind of a wave of response to the first to the Trump presidency and to a lot of those tax cuts and kind of rollbacks on some of our climate work. That Green New Deal really saying, look, this isn't just about a set of sort of green jobs or specific industries. This is really about a whole new type of economy where there is more fairness. There are more fair, family supporting jobs, where we're really building a more sustainable economy. And then the realization of that vision, frankly, in the Biden-Harris Investing in America agenda, the American Rescue Plan, kind of coming out of COVID, planning dollars for communities into the infrastructure bill, into chips and science for semiconductors, which are in most of these systems, and then into Inflation Reduction Act. So those transition strategies really coming out of, I would argue, those shocks and the recognition that the U.S. had become uniquely vulnerable in the face of these economic and geopolitical shocks. So how do all these things come together? Well, they all come together, frankly, in this question of energy and transportation transition. Energy and transport, or energy and fuels, are at the not only fuel the entire economy. We cannot have a functional economy without energy and fuel, but we also are increasingly seeing energy and transportation projects as economic anchors in the new economy that we're trying to build. So this is really where all those pieces come together. We need to get off of volatile, high carbon fuel. What does that look like? We need to move the economy toward one that's more resilient and sustainable. What does that look like? We need to address climate change while also addressing climate impacts. What does that look like? It looks like a new and different kind of economy. What is that economy? Well, these are searches that I do periodically for the question of what is a clean energy economy? What does the clean energy future look like? And what you get if you do a search for this is like, look, it looks great. There's some rolling hills. There's a couple of houses. The city's way off in the background. You'll notice there's no factories. There's no pollution. The question, of course, about this is, these wind turbines that are here, 80% of those is steel. Where is that coming from? Where are those solar panels being made? Where is everybody living? What kind of cars are those? Where are they being manufactured? Like, what's the background to this economy? This clean energy future isn't just a set of clean rolling hills. There's a whole industrial economy behind it. And frankly, that industrial economy looks more like this. This is the reality of what it will take globally to transition from an economy built that since the Industrial Revolution has been built on fossil fuels to an economy that is more diversified, cleaner, builds cleaner products, is lower carbon, and is more centralized and local because of these geopolitical issues. But the reality is that the clean energy industry is still an industry. This is, here we've got EVs being made up in the corner. This middle picture is the Lithium Valley, Salton Sea, where the Department of Energy just funded a big lithium extraction there, and also up north in Humboldt. Obviously, infrastructure for electric vehicles is a massive amount of new electricity infrastructure. We've got wind turbine manufacturing here, and then some direct air capture to actually try to bend the curve on climate impacts. The reality of this is also that it's a land use. These are land use issues. The land use implications of the clean energy transition are significant, and they play out mostly locally. So we're really talking about, first of all, thinking about a lower carbon way of development, thinking about density, thinking about greening, thinking about new ways of doing agriculture, vertical agriculture, regenerative agriculture. Doing wind and solar takes a significant amount of land, and thinking about the balance of that land versus other uses. And then, of course, for transportation, we're changing our entire infrastructure approach from an infrastructure that is about roads to an infrastructure that's also about wires. And what does that look like? It's a significant new amount of energy demand on the system. which in turn will take land, will take investment, will take industry. This new approach, the new economy, the new sustainable economy that, I'm arguing is necessary to meet our goals, but also is necessary for us to build a California economy that is frankly just more resilient and inclusive, means we've got to rethink our regulatory approaches. That is a big deal for California. We are used to leading on climate through regulation, and we're used to doing that essentially by taking a set of tools that were the tools that we used for managing local pollution and grafting those onto carbon. So the California Environmental Quality Act is a good example of that. Written to ensure that industrial projects were creating as little environmental harm as possible. It really measures environmental harm and harm from pollution and harm from projects. The California Air Resources Board, of course, created to deal with air pollution, used to regulating smokestacks, regulating emissions, tailpipes. What we've done with carbon in that picture I had earlier of Governor Schwarzenegger signing the bills, what we've done is sort of say, let's take the approach we used for local pollutants, which is to manage the emissions, to manage the pollutant at the source. Let's do carbon the same way. This turns out to be a slightly complicated way in which to measure carbon, which I'll talk about. It turns out carbon doesn't act like a local pollutant. It only stays in our local atmosphere for about 2 weeks, and then it goes for decades into the global atmosphere. And a ton of emissions in China that's emitted has the same effect on our overall atmosphere as a ton of emissions here. We are managing it, regulating it locally, but it is a global problem. And it's a global problem that then the impacts are felt very locally. So it's really a different situation than managing local pollutants. So what we know is that we have to do this differently. We have to evolve to a new kind of policy approach that's not only based on regulating the pollution and the bad impacts, but actually addressing climate change through holistic action that recognizes that we actually have to build a bunch of things. This isn't just about stopping bad industrial projects. It's about building good industrial projects. It's about doing that across electricity, transportation, land use, planning, tree canopy, agriculture strategy. It is a holistic approach that requires holistic set of solutions, not just individual regulatory tools. Now, why is this so important? Well, part of it is because carbon regulation isn't actually doing that. So carbon regulation on its own has some really important, strong impacts, and it's a very important thing to have, but doesn't stand on its own to solve these problems. This is a chart you've probably seen 100 times on the left here from CARB, the Air Resources Board. It's the chart everybody loves to pull out where they say, look, California is amazing. Our GDP has grown a huge amount while our emissions have gone down. The challenge with this chart is that this is a statewide chart that masks some of the issues within that. Yes, our GDP has gone up statewide. Our emissions have gone down statewide, but at the same time, income inequality, for instance, has grown. So we've seen top incomes growing quickly, lower incomes not growing very quickly. So a widening of the gap underneath that GDP number is a widening of inequality. We have seen an approach to the economy that is great from an emission standpoint, but may not be as great from an economic standpoint. We've seen the rise of what we've called for decades the knowledge economy, the idea that most of our economy, and you can look at this chart, most of our economy is focused in these industries that don't create a ton of pollution, right? So you're looking at finance and real estate and education and health services and professional services, leisure and hospitality, smaller and smaller and smaller amount of this in making stuff. So in manufacturing, there is some, of course, in utilities and transportation, but a smaller and smaller amount of manufacturing. You can see this chart that our manufacturing has just gone down. Our employment has gone down consistently since 2000. And if you go back to the 1970s, it's an even more precipitous drop. So what we've done essentially is to say, let's build up these knowledge sectors. We're losing a lot of our production sectors. And what that means, of course, is that we're buying more and more stuff from overseas because our population has grown and our consumption has grown massively. So thus we get the warehouses that you see here, whole districts and towns of warehouses. Warehousing is an incredibly fast-growing sector in California, and of course, the attendant port activity, truck traffic, et cetera, which brings its own set of environmental issues. It may not be a carbon footprint that looks the way that manufacturing does, but it brings it creates a carbon footprint globally, which, as we just said, means it's a carbon footprint here also. So we've sort of artificially said we're drawing a line around California on carbon and measuring only that, when in fact this is a global set of global factors and global supply interactions. At the same time, carbon regulation hasn't resulted in particularly sustainable fiscal policy for the state. So one thing that a lot of people are grappling with, and we just had a panel on this at our big economic summit a couple of weeks ago, is the issue that our whole current transportation system infrastructure is primarily funded through the gas tax. And that, as we see on this chart, electric vehicles ramp up, we see gas tax reducing, which means that we have less money to pay for that infrastructure. Where does that infrastructure now come from? Where does the funding come from? So the EV truck here is great. We're solving for one of the problems we just created on this last slide, which is this increasing truck traffic at the ports. We solved that by making all those trucks electric vehicles, but making them all electric vehicles ushers in a challenge with our gas tax situation and this question of sort of who's going to pay for the roads if we're losing gas tax revenue. We also have, of course, at the same time that we're losing that revenue, we have massive need for more spending on the public sector side. The climate impacts I talked about earlier are just increasing exponentially. This is a national chart of, and it is adjusted for the dollars are adjusted for real dollars. So this is really true that the cost of these disasters is going up, and there are more of them every year, these billion-dollar events. Government is on the hook to deal with most of the impacts of these events, not only disaster response through things like FEMA or our Office of Emergency Services in California or CAL FIRE, but also because every one of these disasters causes dislocation, causes unemployment, causes the need for food stamps, causes, a whole knock-on effect on the safety net, which is quite expensive for government. And I actually just saw at the New York Fed yesterday a presentation showing that many of our municipalities will literally go bankrupt if we don't start thinking about resilient, front-loading investments in resilience if we continue to let this go on. At the same time, this is not just true nationally, it's true in California. Every part of California has risk of one kind or another. Our infrastructure is not equipped to manage that risk. And so again, we have this increasing costs of dealing with these kind of shocks I talked about. And then we have this sort of fiscal crisis because our system relies on money coming in from a system that we're transitioning away from. And this is a real challenge. This is a fiscal challenge for the state. It's a fiscal challenge also because those same climate impacts make the infrastructure itself more expensive to maintain. So this is Highway 37 that flooded up in the corner. Of course, the big SER section of Highway 1 down in the corner there. We've got roads literally buckling from extreme heat up here in the corner. And then at the bottom, we've got the fact that roads continue to be incredibly important for egress from wildfires. They're how people get out, and you'll see the congestion there. So there is risk to our infrastructure on the transportation side. And as we think about electricity grids as increasingly part of our transportation infrastructure, as we electrify, there's also climate risk to those systems, as we know from transmission line resilience efforts and lines coming down, especially in the Sierras. So this is a set of challenges for sure. Increasing costs, increasing risks, less money to deal with those risks, a need for a new way of thinking about these issues that is not the old way. The old way isn't working. Finally, is carbon regulation leading to more sustainable transportation? Sort of. Yes, on individual vehicles, as we talked about, there's been a lot of regulation around vehicle emissions, around moving to electric vehicles. The fleet itself transitioning not as fast as we'd like. But the other major point about transportation, and the reason that California's transportation emissions have gone up year on year for decades, is really about vehicle miles traveled. It's about the amount we drive. We drive a lot in California. You'll see that whoever's estimate you go with, it's all going up. VMT is going up. We thought it was going to go, this only goes through 2017, but If you look at charts after COVID, there's a little dip during COVID and then it goes up again. We are not seeing a reduction in vehicle miles traveled. We are continuing to make land use decisions about building that are not leading to less VMT. It is true that SB 743, which was implemented while I was at the Office of Planning and Research, and I was very involved in that, does incorporate vehicle miles traveled into CEQA, into the California Environmental Quality Act, as something to be measured for climate. But there's a huge amount that has to be done you can measure it, but how do you manage it? There's a lot that needs to be done to bring those numbers down. You can see this as a chart from I think EDF about how to bring those numbers down. And it requires shifting to electric vehicles. It requires using more renewable energy to charge those electric vehicles, but it also requires different land use patterns, building more densely and more infill and having less sprawl. So all of these things are part of the picture of kind of the transition we need to deal with. So how do we do that? I just talked about a lot of challenges. How do we actually move toward a just transition that is more equitable, where we have a more sustainable economy that's more resilient to these shocks, that is also not just exacerbating that income inequality I talked about? Well, it requires a different way of thinking, moving from model-based and sort of emissions counting and the classic regulatory approach to much more of a place-based approach, to working in places with people to actually do economy-wide transition toward a new kind of system. And what do I mean by place-based? I mean, every place is different. How we do transportation planning in Humboldt County is very different than how we do it in downtown Los Angeles, is very different than how we do it in Kern County and Bakersfield. So what is the place? What is the scope? What is the geography? Who is the population? What's the current infrastructure of that place? What are the current assets? What does the transportation system look like? How do we think about its, how do you transition away from it? And what are the elements of it? In Kern County is extraordinarily dependent for its tax base on oil extraction. So how do we think about that? As we're thinking about transition in Kern, we have to think about transition of the actual fuel itself and that impact on the economy, as well as transition to new technologies and new types of transportation structures. Recognizing that each place has its own challenges and opportunities. There is no one size fits all. Engaging stakeholders directly, community members, industry, labor, in program development and implementation. How do you solve these problems at a place level? Taking a systems approach. This is not just a transportation agency issue. This is an issue across, as I said, every part of the economy, and continuously learning and adapting. So how do we do place-based policy in reality? We did a lot of this when I was in the federal government, so I'll talk about that. This is a chart that we created when I was in the Biden-Harris administration, staffing the interagency working group on coal and power plant communities. So really thinking about this transition question in the coal context, but it's very relevant to the transportation and oil and transportation and sort of planning context. And what we determined is that you have to do several things. To do a transition, to think about this in a place-based way, we need to do a fair amount of planning, that asset mapping of the place, figuring out the pathways to get to where you want to go. There's a lot, because we're transitioning from one kind of economy to another kind, there's actually a lot of remediation and reclamation you have to do. You have to take some things down and then build some new things. In the transportation context, that might literally mean taking down freeways that shouldn't have been built where they were built. People will remember the Central Freeway in San Francisco, which came down in the '89 earthquake, was taken down, and the whole thing was completely replaned. You see this increasingly happening in places where highways were built through communities. So sometimes it means literally taking things down and remediating. This might mean, neighborhood gas stations are very likely to be hard to maintain in a new transportation system. They're not easy to transition to charging infrastructure because people don't stay as long at neighborhood gas stations as they do at like rest stops. So how do you think about their new uses? How do you think about them as part of the system? Remediation and reclamation is huge. How do you make the place whole before you can build something new? Displaced worker funding is a piece of this. And then it means investing in new stuff. So the investing in new stuff is where we tend to focus all of our attention. We love new shiny technology, but investing in new stuff also requires really thinking about what will be competitive. Can I build out a supply chain? do I have the workforce to do this? Do I have the infrastructure to do this? And that's the whole underlying piece. The federal policy that's been passed over the last 4 years is groundbreaking and actually takes a system-wide approach. And this is my former boss, Jennifer Granholm, always talked about the body, right, of policy. First, we had the American Rescue Plan, really a COVID recovery and response plan, putting a lot of money into that planning phase, into helping communities with like the Build Back Better grant program, plan for the future. We get the Infrastructure Investment and Jobs Act, also called the Bipartisan Infrastructure Law. That's like the backbone. We have to invest in our roads, in our charging infrastructure, in our grid, and making it more resilient, in broadband. That's the like, we can't do anything else without this backbone. That program also does significant investments in some of the kind of harder to fund technology on the clean energy side. So battery manufacturing, for instance, some of the hydrogen investments. Then we've got chips and science. This is the semiconductor bill. It turns out semiconductors are in pretty much all the technologies that we need for the clean energy transition. All that, remember that picture I showed of the rolling hills and the wind turbines and the solar panels and the cars, every one of those things has semiconductors. So and turned out that we are heavily dependent on China for those. So this is really a geopolitical and energy security national security imperative, but also creating some supply chains here so that if there's shocks to the system, we don't lose all our semiconductors. And then the Inflation Reduction Act, breathing private sector kind of life into all these programs. It's the tax credits. It's, helping communities access some of this funding for some of this transition. It's really kind of the bulk of the money, but it also is accessed very piecemeal through these tax credits. So you can't really do the Inflation Reduction Act without the other pieces here. So I think the climate community tends to point to it as the one piece that's important, but I'd really point to the whole thing. So back to this slide. So that was all, the federal role, but like, what's the state role? Well, it turns out the state plays a critical role in all of these pieces. The state is where most economic and workforce planning happens. This is where we have most of the economic development money in the national system is at the state level. This is where individual localities are, the best positioned to plan and figure out what their future looks like. States are critically important in the remediation and reclamation space. States do a lot of the brownfield. They through formula spending get a lot of the money for brownfield remediation. States are doing a lot of the oil well capping. They're doing a lot of the sort of workforce, the displaced worker funds all run through the states. States and localities are doing a lot of this investment in new industry and supply chain. Some of that is passed through the federal level. Some of that is state level investments through things like our Green Bank or through our cap and trade, our climate investments, which are all done through cap and trade dollars, are all done at the state level. And then, of course, workforce is a critical state function. States tend to run workforce systems. It's our community colleges. It's our workforce investment board. So a lot of this happens at the state and local level, even though the federal government has just really breathed some life into it. A lot of it really happens locally. The challenge in California is that our state system for doing holistic economic planning toward a more sustainable economy is extremely fractured. So I put this slide up because it demonstrates a lot of different systems that are in place. So the official system for economic development in the state of California, which is over on the right here, is interesting. I got this from the Economic Development Administration website, which takes you through every state's economic development system. Nearly every state in the country has a state agency that does economic development and an EDA office, and then a set of regional economic development arms of the state agency. That's New York system, it's Texas system, it's Florida system, it's most state system. We don't have that. California has a governor's office of business and economic development, not an agency. And what's important about the difference there is that the governor's office, the things that are within the governor's office, I used to work for one, Office of Planning and Research, GoBiz, which is this one, wax and wane according to the governor and what the governor wants to do with them. So this office was, I think, 20 people when Governor Newsom started. It's now in the hundreds. It could go back down. It could go up. It is an arm of the governor's office, not an agency, doing critically important work, but it's not an agency. And we don't have regional agencies that are part of the state agency. We have, most of these things below economic development districts are actually nonprofits. and or economic development being run, across some of the regions of the state, but not all. So I think that's kind of an important distinction. We have a fairly fractured economic development system. So we're not doing some of the holistic planning other states are doing. Because of that, when I was in state government, we created this thing at the time called the Community Economic Resilience Fund, now called California Jobs First, over on the left here, where we said, look, there's not a holistic system. And here we are in COVID, and every region of the state had dramatically different impacts from COVID. And they all needed to recover differently. And we were like, let's come up with a system that says, let's not only recover, let's recover and transition to a more resilient system, a more sustainable and resilient and inclusive economy in each of these regions. Created 13 regions. Someday I can talk about the politics of why they look the way they do. Why is Orange County its own region? Fascinating conversation. We created 13 regions. The 13 regions each got planning dollars, and we got originally actually through that American Rescue Plan, but ultimately through the general fund in California, $600 million for this, for planning and implementation dollars at the regional level. This is not it's a state program, but it is not run by one state agency. These are not government entities, these regions. So, mixed bag. There's some really good work being done here. But these are not sort of entities that are kind of durable structures. And then, of course, in the middle, we have the metropolitan planning organizations, right? This is where all the transportation dollars get spent, is through the metropolitan planning organizations, of which there are 4 big ones: the SACOG, MTC, SANDAG in San Diego, and SCAG down in Southern California, and then a whole bunch of small ones. This is where all the federal transportation dollars run through. You'll note that they're not the same regions as California Jobs First, but they are spending a lot of really critical money. That transportation money is critical to all the rest of these economic decisions and to our overall sustainability. So multiple overlapping fractured systems is a challenge in California. We also have an extremely volatile budget. So our budget context is interesting. We have our revenues for the budget. The budget depends very significantly on income tax and capital gains tax revenues. And you'll just see from these charts on the left that it just goes up and down all the time. That's because incomes are very subject to the whims of the economy. I mean, sort of like, we had a huge budget surplus during COVID because it happened to be true that the wealthiest Californians did quite well on the stock market during COVID. So we had a bunch of money to spend. But this year we have a budget deficit because of, the stock market evened out, and our overall economy is, as I showed earlier, not as diversified as it could be. So we've got these big booms and busts, but we have just massively increased spending. And part of that is because of the slides I showed before. We have more disasters, we have more impacts, we have more shocks to the system, and all of those create more need for more safety net, and that is just an enormous amount of government spending. So volatile revenues, lots of increased spending. How do we manage this? This is a tough system into which to plan for all of these new stresses that we have. So, I think that leads us to a couple of things that we need. We need new investment models. We need to be thinking differently about all the parts of this system, including where does the money come from. I was recently at an event and somebody made the point, and I think it's really important. Every aspect of our current system, our financing system, our government systems, our budgeting systems, our transportation systems, our infrastructure, was designed for a stable climate. We don't have a stable climate anymore. And so we really have to rethink a lot of these systems and be innovative across the board. New investment models could include, new ways of doing public-private partnerships, new ways. We're going to have to think about creative ways to solve, for instance, this gas price issue. How do we start to think about new ways to fund a transportation system that is more sustainable and lower carbon and built differently, that doesn't rest on the back of a gas tax from fossil fuels? How do we think about venture capital moving from being primarily focused on, cool software companies and technologies that aren't necessarily even here in California, to more venture capital into place-based solutions? We're starting to see some of this through organizations like Hawk Tower, which does inland California venture capital, place-based spending. Really interesting. Some VC into things like sustainable agriculture. Looking at green and resilient infrastructure bonds. How do we do bonding differently? And so our bond markets are actually rewarding resilience and rewarding investment into infrastructure that is going to be more sustainable. How do we think about using investment funds for impact on, into impact projects, into new technologies, into innovative approaches to mobility challenges, for instance? Low and no interest loans from the government, things like green banks. Corporate forms. This is a really interesting one, I think. Like, we have a current corporate legal system that rewards short-termism and fast returns. It has quarterly profits. The CEOs are rewarded for giving back money to shareholders. It does not reward long-term sustainability or long-term thinking or mission-driven thinking. But there's new corporate forms coming into play, like public benefits corporations. If you have Allbirds shoes, they're a public benefits corporation. There's a number of them across California. These are structures that actually, where the CEO is responsible for a mission along with shareholder returns and can actually be fired for not upholding the mission. It's built into the corporate structure. New types of employee ownership or community ownership. New models of actual co-ops, right? Other countries are experimenting with this. And of course, community benefit structures. As you heard, I spent a lot of time with the Department of Energy. How do we actually attach public funding to the requirement that companies investing private dollars are thinking about these impacts on place, the sustainability of the project, the resilience of the project, the benefits to workers and communities? And there's more. There's all kinds of new investment models that people are coming up with all the time, which I think are super interesting. Also, we need new land use models. We need to be thinking about, frankly, things like urban growth boundaries. If we're going to reduce our risk in the face of a changing climate, if we're going to reduce our need for driving, if we're going to reduce to maximize the ability of our natural and working lands to act as fire breaks and flood resilience and to continue to be productive, we're going to have to think differently about land use in this state. And that may require going back to some of these 1970s era thinking about growth boundaries and just really taking just a little bit more of an intentional regional approach. We need to think about not building into high risk areas to the extent that we are doing today. Today, it is cheaper to build out into a high risk greenfield than it is to build infill housing in California. That's not a sustainable model, and it's not an equitable model. We are telling people that they can have an affordable place to live without being honest that might not be insurable and it might burn down. This is not an equitable growth pattern. We need to take this seriously, this need for new land use models and the need to really take seriously these high fire risk mapping and flood risk. We need to think about preservation of our industrial land. Industrial land is critically important for building out those supply chains we talked about earlier, to becoming a more resilient economy overall, to making sure that we're not shipping things all over the place in order to get the cheapest goods possible, but really being intentional about building family supporting jobs for people without four-year college degrees and supply chains that will be sustained in the face of shocks. We need to think about building different kind of housing. It's not just where you build, and it's not just zoning, it's about actual building. 96% of all the residential land in California is zoned for single family homes right now. That's a Berkeley project. The Opportunity and Belonging Institute came out with that. Really, really amazing statistic, 96%. We need to be thinking about different models of housing that work for those who cannot currently afford to live in the state and are leaving. And I love this. This is a picture from Singapore. We need to be thinking about building differently to account for the fact that we need more greening. We need more resilience built into our structures themselves. Singapore is a very small footprint, done amazing things with greening their buildings, and I think super cool to think about. And then across all of it, we need to be balanced. I mean, the reality is that I talked a lot about the built environment and about the need for industry and the economy, but biodiversity is part of what keeps our entire species alive and healthy. So balance across all these things, preserving our biodiversity while preserving our ability to live in a social industrial culture that we live in is just going to take intentionality and thought. And so all of this is part of a unified system. It's a transportation system, but it's an economic system. It's a housing system. It's a natural working land system. And I think there's just enormous opportunity for California to, frankly, take a systems approach and build a more sustainable and resilient and inclusive economy. So I'm going to leave it there. I hope you heard all of that and go to questions.
Yeah, thank you. That was really fantastic and a lot to think about there. As we wait for, we do have a question. How do you square the climate economic need for density with public opinion showing that Americans want bigger houses that are further apart? I guess this is from Pew. It seems that the public appetite for necessary changes is very low.
Yeah, I mean, I think that's a really good point. I mean, our houses have grown significantly, as you know, over the last several decades. I mean, the average American house used to be about 1,200 square feet back in the 70s, and now it's, I think, 3,000. So it's really grown. And part of that, I would argue, is honestly that we don't do true cost accounting. We've taken advantage of cheap land and development practices that build, frankly, cheaply. And also to the advent of air conditioning. There's a whole fascinating podcast about how air conditioning has changed all of our development patterns. Because you don't need to build anymore with the materials into a standard that will withstand the climate you're in. You can build a pretty crappy house and have a bunch of systems that keep it at a certain climate. All the elements of that, of course, are not great for the climate. So I think we need to do more true cost accounting in general. We're actually seeing this isn't even me just being kind of a social planner. We're actually seeing this happen in California. Insurance leaving California is, in fact, true cost accounting. That's what's happening. The insurance industry is saying, we literally cannot sustain our business model by taking risk at this level. We are going to abandon the market unless something changes. So I think we're going to see actual pressures like that. I do think it will change the reality of what people want is in part a feature of what people have put in front of them to want. And I think we're going to need to get back to a place where, we also see the same surveys that say that everybody wants to live in a walkable community, right? Like that is, every survey says that. So to live in a walkable community means living in a smaller space with more public space. And I think getting to that, back to that, is going to become more and more necessary as the accounting from insurance and the bond market and other places starts to just really incorporate the cost of these risks.
Yeah, great. Maybe Gen Z will help us with that. With their, I think they drive less and they try to consume less. So maybe they're.
Well, and frankly, like all of us, so should everyone retiring. I mean, the fact is that if you can't drive anymore, you're also a prime candidate to live in a walkable community that's with a smaller footprint. So let's think about, building for those two sides of the market.
Great. Yeah, thanks. How would SB 375 be restructured to advance place-based solutions and reduce reliance on complicated modeling of GHG emissions? Other ideas to verify that regional plans will lead to shared goals. So
SB 375, for those who don't know, is the bill that required the sustainable community strategies from the metropolitan planning organizations, and essentially very laudable goal, right? Very laudable goal to try to figure out how to use these planning agencies to help identify ways to build communities that have lower emissions. They have, I believe, we all think this is true, turned into sort of a very, very expensive and time-consuming box-checking exercise. I'm not sure they're accomplishing what they meant to accomplish. And there was, in fact, just a letter that the four big MPOs, SCAG, SACOG, MTC, and SANDAG, just wrote to CARB basically making this point, saying, look, this isn't working. Your goal was good. This way you're doing it is not working, mostly because, I mean, you saw this in my presentation, all they measure is emissions. If emissions is your only metric, it's very hard to get from that to a sustainable community, because you can do, massively sprawling land use patterns if everything is electrified, and theoretically your emissions, you don't have emissions. But in fact, not everything is electrified, and those systems are clunky, and people are still building up stuff and driving places and, consuming a lot. So I think what the argument is we need a new system. How do we do that new system? I mean, I think there is a need to just, as I said, expand beyond regulation and environmental regulatory processes to do this kind of planning. I strongly believe we need to restore some of our planning dollars to local communities to do this kind of planning. When we took away redevelopment, we took away the ability to plan. And I
Mhm.
think we've got to get planning dollars, durable planning dollars back into communities. Ideally, I would love to see the MPOs actually, which are in a great position to do regional planning, have a little more authority to be
Mhm.
able to think about, to maybe be quasi economic development agencies for their region. You actually see some of this. SCAG does economic modeling for the region, which is quite interesting, and they do it on a regular basis, and I think that's interesting. Like if we could have a kind of a systematic approach for the MPOs where they exist to be able to do that kind of asset mapping and modeling and really look at the interaction of systems, I think that would be incredibly helpful. But this is a system that needs to be reformed. And I'd love to think with all of you about how to do that. I think there's a lot of opportunity there.
Great. Here's another question. As a transportation person, I'm curious about your opinion on politically palatable approaches to replace the gas tax.
Yeah, the gas tax is super tricky, as we talked about. Politically palatable. Well, I think it's hard to do. I know there are people out there who are like, we should just do a VMT tax. We should make everybody pay for how much they drive.
Right.
Super challenging because it's very regressive, although the gas tax itself is regressive, but you're charging people who have to drive more. And in California, there's a major lack of affordable infill housing. And so a lot of people have to drive a lot. And there's not transit. I mean, this is not a state like I'm in New York City right now. It is a very different situation here than in most of California in terms of the options to not drive. So I think we need to be looking at things like, trucks do have the major wear and tear on highways. Most of the highway maintenance does come from heavy truck traffic issues. And so, let's think about tiered systems where we're actually charging based on the actual impact on the system. I don't think that's a terrible idea. I think, I do think making it easier for people not to drive is really important. So thinking about rebalancing some of our spending toward transit and micro mobility, obviously options not being, more walkability, more bikeability is important. Treating e-bikes as an actual mode of transportation and giving more support to them, I think, is an interesting idea. On-demand van pools, other things for smaller communities. We just need to be more creative. But where the money comes from, I do think we're going to have to take a hard look. Because right now our system is like gas tax, and then everyone's like, just do tolling to make up for that. And those are fairly clunky systems that still rely on a massive amount of driving to work. So how do we sort of shift away from that is a good question. We can't shift away from that easily for our freight, though. So maybe we could think about freight as a big piece of the puzzle. And rail's never been really incorporated into the system, but if we move stuff from trucks to rail, like what does that look like? Can we start planning a little more holistically on rail as well? Be interesting question. We don't have a rail authority really in California. We have the high-speed rail authority, but we don't have anybody whose job it is to think about high-speed rail plus Amtrak plus Caltrain plus BART plus Muni plus Metro. Like that is a big system that is actually sort of a big piece of infrastructure in the state that we should be thinking about holistically.
Yeah, good. Okay, next question. What does the need to build less in high risk areas, all those such as those threatened by fire, mean practically when there are so many individuals who are wed to these communities, even when they know the risks? Do we disregard them or attempt to persuade them? Are there intentional incentives we could create?
Yeah, I think there's a really big difference between, so note that I said more development or like increased. What I'm trying to say is let's not keep developing more in these areas. We currently have 11 million households in high fire risk areas. So
Wow.
we've got to come up with, and by the way, that most of that growth was in the last couple of decades that we have grown enormously into these areas, in large part because of the search for what we talked about earlier, like larger parcels with fewer people around them and, sort of a sprawl thing. But so I think we've got to think differently about existing infrastructure versus new. For existing, I think some of it means doing everything we can to de-risk where we can. And that's not just individual, like vegetation management for individual properties. It also may mean things like taking people off power grid and putting in microgrids or smaller systems that island communities, and being supportive of that, like helping people with that, with public dollars, with private dollars. I think that's something we need to be thinking about much more strategically. We need to think about this at a community scale, not an individual house scale. that's something that we're pushing the insurance industry to do, is to insure at a community scale. If a community has done a lot to make itself more resilient, that should be accounted for in premiums. It shouldn't just be about every individual parcel gets determined on an individual basis. So there are people thinking about this. But what it means in terms of new development is that you've got to couple anything we do to reduce new development in high risk areas means has got to be coupled with increasing development in low risk areas. So it does mean allowing for much more infill development, which has its own set of community challenges and NIMBY challenges. But again, I think, it's sort of not an option. I mean, California's become a very high risk place to do development, and we will literally lose our insurability if we don't deal with this. And nothing will be affordable. So I think electricity bills and insurance are both very, very high cost things, as well as the maintenance of infrastructure to these places. Those will come, those costs are not being paid for by some secret resilience money tree in Sacramento. They are being paid for by all of us, by taxpayers, by ratepayers, by insurance premiums. We are paying today, and we are not going to be able to keep affording to do that. So I think that the system has to change.
Great. Let's
Long
see.
answer,
Question. Can you discuss how the U.S. can pursue a clean energy transition yet achieve energy sovereignty? Domestic technology and manufacturing investment, of course, is key, but how do we have the workforce and regulatory flexibility to realistically compete globally, where global equals China?
Yeah, we can compete on some things and not everything. I mean, I think you can't think of this as, I am not arguing for a totally protectionist agenda where we build walls around the United States and do everything here.
Mm-hmm.
We can't, like, we have lost most of the solar supply chain we can't be competitive on, frankly, at this point, because we offshored it all already. We can on some new technologies. We certainly can on technologies where it really matters, where they're very heavy, for instance. And so transportation, wind turbines are a great example. It's very expensive to transport those. So you can be more competitive near the thing. Building materials have always been a very local market because of just transportation cost issues and kind of just-in-time delivery issues. So you need to do kind of a classic economic development approach to these industries. There's a very good paper. If you get my Substack, which you should, I just wrote about this. There's a very good paper out of Carnegie that I'm a Carnegie non-resident scholar, and my colleague there, Milo McBride, just did a really good paper about this exact question. What technologies are we competitive on, and which part of those supply chains are we competitive on? Super, super interesting. And basically the short answer is we're competitive on batteries. We're competitive on magnetic motors. We're competitive on some pieces of, it's not everyone's favorite thing, but critical minerals. We're competitive, especially because the places we get them now are very geopolitically tricky. China and the Democratic Republic of Congo are the main places. So Russia as well. So, we're competitive on certain things. And I think we need to make those decisions. Like, the Defense Department makes decisions all the time about things that we want to make here in the United States or in allied countries because of national security concerns. We should be making similar determinations on a climate basis.
Okay, and let's see, maybe one last question. How are we supposed to respond to the wacko contention that windmills are bad for nature and farming?
I mean, yeah, that's a great question. I mean, how are we supposed to respond to kind of any wacko thing from any NIMBY person is a great question. I do think, I don't know. I mean, I would love to be able to say that the answer to that question is you just have to have good information, but I don't actually think that's true. My experience in general in this space, and I have spent a lot of time in Wyoming and West Virginia and Alaska and in the Central Valley, and a lot of time in red states and regions. And my experience is that the more local the conversation, the more effective the conversation. Don't have a conversation about wind turbines generally. Have a conversation about a specific place, a specific investment, and the specific benefits that will come from that investment. It's just a different conversation. If you can get it down from in general, like, national coalitions and trade associations are not helpful on things. If you can get to the local like people with a local stake are the people that you want to talk to. I think it can be a much more productive conversation. And look, most of the investments from those bills that I talked about are going to red states. And that is not because the Biden-Harris administration is deliberately sending all those investment to red states, it's because the red states are actually doing a very good job of making an economic argument for those investments. And I think, there's something to be learned from that.
Well, there's a number of questions left, but I believe you have to go. So
I have to go. I can
say
probably do
thank you.
maybe 2 more and I'll just answer them fast.
Okay, great. How do we prevent the blocking of needed housing supply or other infrastructure needed to accommodate more people in existing communities if we return more planning dollars to local municipalities?
Oh, so I think the argument there is that it's the local government that's blocking those. I mean, I think you give planning dollars, but you also couple your other investments with policy choices. Like right now, for instance, our housing finance agencies provide a lot of funding for housing that is not particularly climate friendly. So we should just be more aligned, right? Like if we have climate goals as a state, which we do, and we want to make sure that we're balancing across these different uses, natural working lands, urban development. We want to try to reduce emissions. We want to build affordable housing. We actually need to align our incentives with that. That means aligning incentives for transportation dollars, for housing dollars, for financing, for infrastructure bonding. The Infill Infrastructure Grant Program is a great example of this. It's a great program under Governor Newsom, which basically says, if you build infill housing, we will support the underlying infrastructure. That's a big part of the cost of building housing. And so I think that's really helpful. It's like, we're going to give you money, but only if you're aligned, right? So I think we should just be thinking about that. Generally, there's a lot of super interesting work being done on VMT mitigation banking and other ways to potentially get money from when a project has to have increased VMT for one reason or another, like you have to build a road to a community so it has egress in a fire, for instance. That increases VMT. They've got to mitigate. If we could think about banking those mitigation dollars and funneling them toward things like infill infrastructure, that could be a real help. So, it just means aligning. It does mean, and this is controversial, it means more planning at the state level, not all at the local level. I recognize that's controversial. That's why Oregon has growth boundaries, is they do state level planning. I'm not saying take it all back, but I do think climate risk, geopolitical risk, economic risk is a state issue. The state is holding the bag on those costs. The state has a vested interest in reducing that risk. And so I think we should do more at the state level. And I can do one more thing.
Okay, last one. Why do we not provide statewide incentives for aging in place housing for our increasing senior population, thereby making supply of highly sought after single family homes for young families and bring the cost of aging under more control?
Well, 2 words, Prop 13 is why. Prop 13 incentivizes people to stay in their homes. I live in Berkeley. My street, which is in a very walkable neighborhood, has probably 6 houses on it that are 4-bedroom houses that have an individual person in their 80s living in them.
Right.
Why? Because they're holding on to it so that they can pass it on to their descendants and they can still get the Prop 13 property value. Like, that's why. So until we fix that, it's a very hard question to answer. I do think we should make it easier. There's been all kinds of reforms floated on this, on, raising the property tax and then having it be, part of the sale price. There have been things around letting people take the value with them one time. All kinds of reforms have been proposed. None of them have passed. I think 27 times it's been tried to be reformed. None of them have passed. I will say that Prop 5 on the ballot right now is an attempt to try to fix the proposition system a little bit to make sure this kind of thing doesn't keep happening. It is very, very close. It may not pass. So this is a tough one in California. It's the rationale behind a lot. It's also, you saw that chart I had with the volatile state budget. The reason that California is so dependent on income tax and capital gains tax for our budget is because our property taxes are artificially low. Other states have a much more balanced budget approach. So this is a real issue. And any of you coming up in the policy world, this is something you should be focused on because it is a critical barrier to everything I just talked about.
Well, great. Well, on behalf of Citrus and ITS, thank you so much, Kate Gordon.
Thank you. Thanks everybody for coming. Really glad you could be here. Sorry again not to be able to talk to you all in person, but I appreciate everyone being here. And Therese, thank you so much.